Three mere mortals discover their ability to create entire universes with their minds alone. Upon discovering their abilities, these three, gods if you will, join forces to create the Dark and Stormy Nights, a supercharged team of creatives with the aim of helping artists and writers around the world while combating the forces of boredom and mundanity. They are the Dark and Stormy Nights.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is Loki.
And this is Tyr.
And we are the Dark and Stormy Nights. This week we have
A little bit of story.
a little story from Tyr. Tyr has written you a lovely chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any overview that you want to go before we do it? Well, first off, do we have any news?
Any news?
Do you have anything new?
Not that I'm thinking of. I still have that free book. If you want to sign up for my newsletter, you get a free prequel to my new series that will be coming out shortly.
Tell them how they do that.
Just go to my website, which is novadrake.vegvasirmedia.com, and there's a post with the sign up link, or there's probably going to be a pop up with the sign up link, and there's also like a permanent sign up right on the side of the page there. So there's plenty of places to find it, but basically sign up for the newsletter. You'll get an automatic email with the code for the free book.
You can't beat it. Go sign up. And I'm still writing, so sorry. Nothing new for me yet. I'm still working on it. Got some great ideas, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
So, all right. Do you want to jump into the story, or?
If you're ready for me to start, I can.
Yeah, we can go ahead and jump into it.
Okay. All right. Lee steered the car towards the safety of the huntsman while Eliot's face turned a concerning shade of red in his passenger seat. Whoa, kid, breathe. You're safe. Not a scratch on ya. No need to be dramatic. Eliot shot him an incredulous look, which was an impressive feat given the hyperventilating. Lee, I think your partner might be more upset about his hoard. That's a rough break, losing everything like that. It was a little-known fact that goblins all had a stash hidden somewhere, and they guarded their collections fiercely. Oddly enough, those collections were never anything of value, but for some reason the creatures had hoarding instincts that went beyond weird and borderline on obsessive. Lee had once stumbled upon a goblin with a collection of eyeballs. He'd nearly lost his own when the owner decided that Lee was there to take them. That had been a messy job. He shuddered at the memory as Gary carried on. That happened to my great-aunt Alice once. She had an impressive stash, too. Collected over 90 years. She got in a fight with her husband over picking up his socks and ended up stabbing him. He retaliated by blowing up her hoard. He had a bit of a temper. Gary shook his head. There was fur everywhere. But that very day, she started a new hoard, so it just goes to show you it's never too late to start over. Lee shot a bewildered look into the rearview mirror. On the plus side, Eliot had calmed slightly as he listened to Gary's story, so maybe the goblin was onto something. Eliot sniffed. That was both horrifying and mildly comforting. Gary nodded in agreement. You'll get a new hoard, kid. By the time my aunt finally died, she had an entire house filled with eyeballs. All started from just the 2 she'd taken from her husband that day. Lee's eyes widened, and he shot a panicked glance over his shoulder, but Gary didn't let on that he knew anything about his aunt's death. The goblin was too busy patting himself on the back for cheering up Eliot. The kid was looking a little less red, though a little more green. Lee returned his eyes to the road, saying nothing. For all he knew, eyeballs were a common hoard. The goblin he'd run into could have been anyone. Yeah, he was going with that. Eliot sank down further into his seat and pulled out his cell phone. He trailed off and shook his head. I'm not upset about my stuff, or I'm not just upset about my stuff. Pops goes in at night sometimes to prep for the next day. He pressed the phone to his ear and then pulled it away to dial again when he couldn't get through. The more he tried, the more his panic grew. Lee tossed Gary a look, hoping he had more endearing stories to share, but the goblin wasn't picking up on his cue. You think your dad was in the building? Gary grimaced. Yeah, no way anyone survived an explosion like that. Magically induced to burn hard and fast. Not my dad, Eliot's breathing grew labored again, and Lee knew it was going to be on him to keep the kid from a full-on panic attack. He racked his brain for some comforting words, but came up short. Comforting wasn't his department. Maybe distraction would work. So, eyeballs. That's probably a pretty popular collection choice among goblins, huh? Gary gave Lee an indecipherable look. One of a kind, actually. But Lee, this ain't the time for a history lesson. So have some sensitivity. The kid's freaking out. Lee pressed his lips together as he pulled into the parking lot of the Huntsman, chastised by a goblin over his insensitivity. That had to be a new low. Lee bailed out of the car the moment he pulled the keys from the ignition, and Gary wasn't far behind. This is where we part ways. Hey, you sure you're going to be okay with that kid? I can take him over to the Huntsman if you want. Lee snorted. You know the girls hate it when you call it that. And no, I'll keep him with me for now. We don't know if the Fristvarger are still around. If Nigel can't help him, I might bring him by. Good thinking, Lee. Yeah, you too. Appreciate the assist. Gary smirked as he turned and walked away. He knew what Lee had done, avoiding words like thank you because they had power with all kinds of other. But they both knew it wouldn't matter in the end. Lee owed the man one, and he'd have to pay up sooner or later. Lee managed to get Eliot out of the car and into the Huntsman, but the kid barely made it 10 steps in the door before he was wheezing and dialing his phone again. Lee left him behind and strode to the desk, dinging the annoying little bell repeatedly until a disgruntled desk clerk in a tattered robe and pajamas appeared, clutching his coffee cup as always. Nigel snatched the bell off the counter and set it under the desk. Lee, to what do we owe the pleasure? Save it, Nigel. I want answers, Lee demanded, forgetting Eliot in the face of his anger. What do you know about a conveniently timed flu epidemic in 1918? Anyone else would have missed the tell, barely there one moment and then gone the next, but Lee saw the unflappable sorcerer stiffen defensively before turning his attention over his shoulder. My God, Lee, don't you think you should help your partner first? My what? Lee growled, annoyed with the deflection until he remembered that he did indeed have a partner and noticed he was seconds from passing out. While Lee was still catching up, Nigel jumped into action, breezing past him and dosing Eliot with a low-grade spell that allowed the poor kid to gasp in some much-needed air. Eliot calmed before their eyes, and once he was breathing normally, Nigel led him toward the counter where Lee was waiting. There. Now why don't you explain the problem? Nigel prompted. His place blew, Lee offered. All his things, his job, his side business, all of it's ash. Eliot whimpered, and Nigel shot Lee a sharp look. Just saving us some time, he muttered defensively. No, Eliot finally interjected. All that sucks, but like Gary said, it's just stuff. But I can't get a hold of Pops. Who's Gary? Nigel questioned. No one, Lee cut Eliot's answer off. Why don't you answer my question about 1918? Really, Lee, show some sensitivity. Eliot's clearly upset about his father. Not my father. He ran the pizza shop and he might have been in the building, but I don't know because I can't get through. The phone just rings. Eliot was starting to get worked up again, and Nigel swooped into action. Ah, I see. I believe I can help with this. The man turned on his heel, more gracefully than anyone in a mullet and a bathrobe should have, and headed straight for the black and white tube television sitting on the counter, playing episodes of I Love Lucy with no sound. Nigel adjusted the rabbit ears and fiddled with a dial, and the picture went from wavy gray lines to a picture of Pops frantically pacing his living room in his pajamas with a phone pressed to his ear. There, Nigel waved a hand at the screen. He's just fine. A little upset, but that's to be expected. Wait, that's him right now? Nigel nodded, give or take a few seconds. But he clearly wasn't in the building when the explosion happened. I'm sure he's been getting nonstop calls from the police and the fire department. But give it time. You'll be able to get through. Eliot deflated in relief. Thank you. Of course. Okay, do you want to break there and then...
We can. Yeah.
Okay.
So, all right. I love it.
Okay.
That was great. I love the deflection,
Okay.
like the constant, because Nigel's completely deflecting this whole time.
Right.
And of course, he has a good excuse and everything.
Right. Yeah,
But
and
this is
we'll get into that a little bit more as the chapter goes on.
But I distinctly get the feeling that Nigel would be nowhere near as attentive to Eliot's needs were he not deflecting.
Right.
You know, I like the new debt to Gary. So I like that because I get the feeling that before all of this, Gary had Gary owed a debt maybe to Lee, and now it's
Tables
reversed.
turned,
Yeah,
right.
And it's like, ooh, I don't think Lee likes having a debt to anybody.
Right.
You know, it's bad enough he's got this debt. You know, the major debt that holds him in place.
So that's kind of something I played on later in the chapter as well. But yeah, he's I get that feeling as well. Like, he already has this huge debt. Racking up more debt is detrimental to him. You know, he can't just keep paying off these debts. Because
Right.
First of all, he's already broke. You know, and second of all, like every ounce of effort, basically you're taking pieces of his life. You know, he's putting his ass on the line every time he pays off these debts.
Well, I think it's a little bit of why he's such a dick, right? He goes in there and he takes what he wants. He doesn't owe anybody shit because he took it. He didn't bargain it, you know.
Right.
And now this wasn't really something he chose, but it's something he accepted. So therefore,
right. I mean, he's kind of got to keep basically putting pieces of himself out there in order to pay off these debts.
Right.
And every debt feels like it's literally a part of himself, you know. So yeah, it's like that's kind of his theme throughout the whole story, you know. So
and I absolutely love the hoarder thing. And I'll tell you why. I do in-home health on occasion, okay? And some of my patients are hoarders.
Yeah.
And it is almost always something somewhat specific. You know, I mean, there's other problems that come with the hoarding of that specific thing. Strangely enough, newspapers or magazines are some of the most common ones, or what have you. And I can now imagine these people are part or whole goblin. And it makes total sense, you know.
I was kind of thinking like the way dragons are, you know, lore says that they hoard certain things, usually treasure. You know, it's something you can see, like a reason for hoarding. I figured goblins, you know, same thing, different concept with, you know, obviously goblins might like treasure, sure, but would they really have access to hoarding treasure? So their hoarding instincts are kind of filled with what they have access to.
I think goblins may consider, because goblins are often depicted as very feral, strange creatures, right? With somewhat, they are somewhat intelligent beings, you know, capable of forming societies and building things and all that jazz. But they're not as complex. And to them, treasure is what they believe treasure is.
That's the thing, is that I kind of wanted it to be something like each of them had like this thing, and then their hoarding instincts kicked in with that thing. And like I didn't even explain what the first hoard was that his aunt had. I just said for everywhere from the explosion. So like really it could have been cats, it could have been taxidermied animals. It could have been, you know.
I'm like, fur everywhere. This got disturbing.
Exactly. So I mean truly it could have been something innocent and then, you know, only disturbing because of the explosion, or it could have been like, you know, something horrifying.
So yeah, and then I almost like the feeling that you gave without saying it, that they don't judge each other's hoard. That it's just you have a hoard and that's your treasure and that's okay.
Right.
And there's no judgment of what that hoard is. It's just how they are. Every goblin knows that every other goblin has a hoard. It doesn't matter what it is treasure to that goblin.
Right.
Which is interesting now because it's also a bargaining chip. Because every goblin is going to want more of what's in their hoard, and especially if you have something.
That's true. It could be currency.
Right. So it's like, well, that goblin that collected eyeballs, say.
So you bring him a couple of eyeballs.
Not just eyeballs, but what if it's a rare type of eyeball?
What if that's a courting
like
thing?
A violet one, like Liz Taylor or
that's
whatever,
good.
like
that's
that.
a good idea.
Because that's a really rare condition.
But like, what if it's a courting thing? Like you like a goblin, you find out what hoard they have, you bring them one of those things, you know?
Oh yeah, maybe friends or more.
Right. No, but that's like kind of how I played it off. Like she stabbed him in anger over something stupid, but then he doesn't explain that. He doesn't say she has a temper. He says that her husband had a temper because he blew up her hoard after she stabbed him, you know? So like that kind of, I was trying to like play up the importance in their culture, you know?
Right, yeah. No, I like it. I like the whole hoard thing. I feel like we almost got to throw...
Like stabbing in an argument, whatever. Well, but blowing up a hoard is a big deal.
I feel like a goblin's hoard could almost be a good scenario or situation to end up in somewhere in this. I mean, I don't know where we would use it just yet, but can you imagine being lost inside a goblin's hoard? You know, like almost like a labyrinth of something or other.
Like they have it like stored down in like an old tunnel room or something.
Yeah,
like
something like a dugout thing below their basement, like a root cellar full of something.
Maybe.
So I know it's an interesting visual. In fact, I'm almost seeing that if this was a TV show or a movie or whatever, they'd have given us while he's telling the story, we'd have had the visual of the, of the horde, of them, the whole fight ensuing while he's talking about it.
Nearly getting, buried in eyeballs while he's trying to kill this goblin.
Right. Just gross. So, okay. I dig it. Anything else?
Not really. We can take a break and come back
All right.
to finish it off if you like.
Let's do that. We'll be back in a minute.
Why my drippings will go?
Because you were listening to the Dark and Stormy Nights podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, or Podbean.
All right, we are back with the second half of this story. So whenever you're ready, let's jump into it. I can't wait to hear what comes next.
Just get right back in? Okay, so we left off with Nigel and Eliot kind of new buddies. Okay, so great, Lee snapped. Now how about you start talking, Nigel? I'm hearing things. You shouldn't believe every little rumor you hear, Lee. You know that. Imagine if everyone believed every rumor there was about you. They do, 'cause it's all true. You're avoiding the question. Let me refresh your memory, old man. In 1918, there was an epidemic in the area. A flu that wiped out an unusual number of children. You want to tell me your side of the story? I wouldn't have a side of the story, seeing as I wasn't in the area in 1918. Lee gritted his teeth. I meant the Combine side of the story. Nigel hesitated. As far as the Combine is concerned, there is no story. Illnesses come and go. Most don't wipe out changelings with incredible accuracy. Don't tell me they had nothing to do with it. I want answers. Those holier-than-thou assholes sit on their thrones making rules for everyone else. Who's making sure they aren't the monsters? They don't have thrones. Lee slammed a fist down on the counter, making Eliot jump, but he quickly returned his eyes to the scene where Pops was driving to the pizza shop, or what was left of it. Nigel, Lee growled. I don't have an answer for you, Lee. Certainly not one you're going to like. It was a different time, a different world. I wasn't part of the Combine back then, and I can't speak to the reasons they had for the choices that were made. All I'm hearing are excuses. I don't need their reasons. Their choices are coming back to bite them on the ass, literally, and I'm wondering why I should risk my own ass to stand in the way of karma. Nigel lifted his chin. I'm not making excuses for anyone. What I'm saying is that I can't give you what you're looking for. Yeah? And what am I looking for? Justification. You want to know that you're working for the right side. You don't want to question whether the Combine has just moved from spells to bounty hunters to clean up innocent problems they don't want hanging around. But Lee, you know that's not the case. I won't say that mistakes haven't been made over the years, but the vast majority of what the Combine does has kept humanity safe, the supernatural community a secret, and prevented any one faction from gaining too much power and taking over, enslaving humans, or starting wars with each other. In their absence, it would all devolve into chaos, and you know it. It would be constant wars between the species to be in control of all other. The Combine is the only thing keeping them from taking over. Because the sorcerers decided it was them in charge, Lee pointed out. Nigel shrugged. They have the power to do it. And with their power, they've refrained from enslaving humankind or ruling over all other species more than what they've deemed necessary. That's the problem. What they deem necessary ain't always right. No one is always right, Lee. But the Combine has kept things from being much worse. Lee couldn't argue that point, but that didn't mean he was happy with anything Nigel had said. Speaking of, I have a job for you. Lee's eyes narrowed. He had a feeling he knew exactly what this next job would be. Protection detail. This one is all hands on deck. Lee snarled, ready to argue, when a frantic tugging on his arm pulled his attention to Eliot. Lee, we gotta go. Now. Eliot pointed to the screen where Pops was now at the pizza shop, clutching his chest and being rushed to an ambulance. Come on, I need a ride to the hospital. Done with the conversation with Nigel, Lee nodded and headed for the door. I'll send you the details to your phone, Nigel called as the door closed behind him. Lee had a feeling he already had the details on the card tucked into his pocket, but he'd deal with all of that later. Eliot gnawed on a fingernail, seemingly lost in thought until he muttered, Can't you go any faster? Lee looked up at the traffic light. It's a red light, kid. Eliot's eyes snapped up at the light. He looked around as if he hadn't been seeing anything a moment ago. The radio reception grew staticky, and Lee gave the dash a solid smack to get it working again. Smoke on the water blared through the car's speakers just as Eliot straightened up in his seat. What is it? Lee asked, scanning the street for whatever had alarmed him. Under the streetlight up ahead, a single child stood, staring at their car. You afraid of children now, too? Actually, Lee didn't blame him for that one, but he wasn't going to admit that out loud. When they look like that, I am. Like what? Lee looked again. this time noticing the knife clutched in the kid's hand and the murderous expression on his face. Okay, that's creepy, he agreed. He turned his eyes back to the street, finding another child illuminated in the car's headlights. Gah, he startled. Eliot shot him an I told you so look, but then his eyes shifted to the window and widened. Oh God, we're surrounded. Lee looked out his window, seeing the children that Eliot was talking about. Under the glamored streetlights, they looked normalish, if a little ill. But the others were far from normal. Sharp teeth and pointed ears were easily overlooked for the horrific injuries that littered their bodies. They moved in, and Lee wasted no time slamming on the gas pedal, not bothering to check if the light had changed. Go, go, Eliot yelped, but the car sputtered and stalled. What the hell's wrong with it? Lee tried starting the car again, and it sputtered and stopped. Lee, what is that? Lee looked at the floor of the car, seeing smoke filling the interior. He looked out the windshield, seeing again nothing but smoke coming from under the hood. Shit, you ain't gonna like this, kid, but we need to bail. What? Eliot squeaked. As in, get out of the car? Are you nuts? The car's filling with smoke. Something under the hood is smoking. We gotta get out of this car. No way, Eliot insisted, even as his coughing started. Lee sighed and pulled a gun and 2 knives. You know how to shoot? Eliot's eyes widened. No. Eliot handed over a knife. Give me a few seconds, then get out of the car. I should be able to take out a few kids. Lee, you can't kill them. They're kids. Those aren't kids. Do you see them? Well, they used to be kids then. Yeah, so did I. It's us or them, kid. I know which one I'm picking. Lee jumped out of the car before Eliot could argue more. The second Lee was out, the changelings closed in. He aimed his gun, offering one warning. I don't want to hurt you. Walk away, and we'll all go about our business. Lee was pretty sure he knew what these kids were and why they were angry. It was hard to blame them. I had nothing to do with what happened to you. He tried again when they kept coming. The closest creature bared its teeth in a snarl, its bloody eyes unfocused but intent. The closest kid lunged, prompting the rest into action. Lee didn't hesitate to fire his gun, hitting several of the creatures before he realized it wasn't taking them down. The impact knocked them back momentarily, but did nothing to stop them. With a groan, he pulled a bigger knife, swinging at the closest threat. A sharp pain in his calf had him swirling to kick away the upper half of a creature that had dragged itself closer to get a taste of him. God damn it, Lee grumbled. That shit better not be contagious. He was going to have to call in another favor to make sure he hadn't contracted anything. Just as it seemed Lee was making some progress with the creatures, he swiped at a kid that he was sure he'd already taken out. One glance at the ground showed that to be true. They were on the floor picking up body parts and reattaching them, whether they belonged to them or not. Once they could move, they were back in the fray. Lee's cursing was drowned out by a coughing fit as Eliot emerged from the car in a cloud of smoke. Holy shit, he shrieked as he scrambled up on top of the car. Eliot danced in a panic as little broken bodies attempted to reach him. Lee, get them away. What do you think I'm doing, kid? What do they want? My guess? Revenge. This shit was done to them and they're pissed. I didn't do it. Why are they coming after us? It's a good question, kid. Lee grunted as he struggled to keep from getting bit again. Hopping up onto the trunk, he continued kicking at the little creatures, trying to follow. Hate to say it, but we might have a problem. What? You said you'd take care of it. That was before I knew they could put themselves back together. Eliot's words were cut off by the revving of an engine as the Charger blew through the bodies and screeched to a halt inches from the Celica. The passenger door pushed open and Rowan leaned across the front seat. Get in, she ordered. Okay, that's where we decided to leave it off.
Yep, good enough. We don't need to tell every detail of them getting in and everything.
Right.
So, I dig it. Eliot's a total wuss.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, here's the thing. I think that if it was something other than children, he would have been a little bit more willing to fight, but that was his.
I mean, I don't know. Once I see the gnarliness of what they really are, I think all bets are off.
I don't feel that way. I feel like even if it was children, even if it was monster children, I would have a hard time.
Oh, no way, man. You got this creepy.
His issue isn't just that he's a wuss, it's that he's got a moral issue here.
Children are bad enough. Children are creepy without being undead, right? I mean, they're gross and sticky and all kinds of problems, okay? But then you add in undead, let alone Fae, which he doesn't know anything about, I mean, he's been introduced to this world for all of a few days.
I don't think that Fae children really have anything to do with. Like, I think that at the point when he sees a Bodak, or something.
Oh, the Bodak, probably
Yes.
really frightening. Because I imagine.
No, I get he'll
did
be
we
afraid.
really describe
but
the
I
Bodak?
think yes, in the prologue.
Right.
So, like, yeah, he'll be afraid, but he'll be more willing to fight something like that. Something
Right.
that he can see is a monster. Whereas these kids are beaten and battered and ill, but they're still kids, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't have a problem hitting a kid with a shovel or something like that.
Jesus Christ. He doesn't have a shovel.
Even if they weren't undead. So
You know what I should do? I should have him grab some Axe body spray from the glove box of Rick's car and then try spraying the kids in the eyes with it.
nice. You could always pull out his lighter and make it a flamethrower or something like that. This is the best smelling flamethrower ever. It's Axe. It is not the best smelling flamethrower ever.
But I guarantee Rick has a glove box full of Axe.
Oh yeah, he's an Axe kind of guy. Or what's the other, like body glove or something like that? You know.
I don't even know what that is.
So I'm just naming like douchey fragrances. Drakkar. It's Drakkar spray. So.
All right. So anything you want changed?
I don't think so. No, I think it went really well. I think it's almost exactly as we planned it. You know, the only other thing we were going to do, which I said we could probably stop short because I think the hospital is another scene.
Yeah,
So
no, we marked that for future chapters, so I think that's the next chapter.
Right. So yeah, I mean, if they would have jumped in the car, it would have just been to the next scene. And I say, we don't need to describe them getting in the car. We'll just, when they get out of the car at the next scene, you understood they got in the car.
Well, we talked about, like, when they arrive at the hospital, what it is that Eliot's going to hop out of the car and he's going to look to Lee, hey, you coming? And Lee's going to be like, I'll catch up. And that's when he has a conversation with Rowan while Eliot goes up to the hospital room just as Nigel's walking out.
Right.
And that solved two problems. One, you show that Lee is already starting to question Rowan of her conveniently showing up at just the right moment. And two, Lee would have recognized Nigel, whereas Eliot won't. He just, hey, that was the insurance man.
Well, we'll talk about all that in the next episode where we do the planning.
Right. Well, that was the plotting that we had made last week.
Were there any key things we need to carry over from your chapter?
The fight between Lee and Nigel is somewhat unresolved.
Right.
Nigel didn't really have answers for him. Lee was left unsatisfied. So they're still a little salty with each other. So that might carry over somewhat.
Yeah. We'll have to discuss whether we think Lee and Nigel cross paths in the hospital and if the fight picks up there, which would probably confuse Eliot if it did.
Yeah, I don't think that you should have them cross paths at the hospital.
So, yeah, he crossed paths with Eliot but not Lee.
Right.
So.
Right. And then I think that you need to you'll have to resolve things between Eliot and Pops.
Right.
So those are the things we'll have to pick up.
Yeah, this is I don't think the next one's going to be a very super exciting episode. It's just going to be a little bit of resolution of a few things.
I mean, some resolution. It'll depend on how into it you want to go.
Okay.
The other thing is that we kind of posed the question about. So there was some setup. We posed the question about if these are vengeful spirits or risen dead, why are they going after Lee and Eliot instead of the sorcerer?
Right.
So that brought up kind of there's other motive here
right.
than just revenge. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Maybe they have that discussion a little bit, like, okay,
right.
there's more to it.
Right, because we mentioned it for a second, and all he said was, "That's a good question, kid." Because he was like, "Well, we didn't do it. Why are they coming after us?"
Yeah.
So that's all that's been addressed so far. But yeah, maybe you'll want to expand on that.
All right. Well, we'll come back in the next episode and talk about that. Is there anything else we need to let people know before we close for the day? I
don't think so.
So go follow us at the Dark Stormy K1 on Twitter. Go check us out at r/Dark and Stormy Nights on Reddit. Follow along with the show, or we also have a website, thedarkandstormynights.vigbasirmedia.com.
Feel free to comment on the episodes or toss us your ideas.
Right. We will talk about your ideas, and we will be, hopefully shortly, we're waiting for phone companies to come back because I need to get a new phone. We're going to start plugging in and letting people call in here and there so that we can add a third wheel to the show occasionally. So keep that in mind, and if you comment and we like your idea, we'll talk about it on the air. So we will see you next week. Thank you.